Hey, Lark and Rose here. Going to do a rant about property and ownership, which are really just the same thing. To own something means to have the exclusive right to decide what is done with that thing. I own this shoe. This is my shoe. I get to decide what's done with it. Nobody else has the right to decide what's done with it without my consent. If I agree to give it to somebody, then it's theirs. If I trade it for something, then I can loan it to somebody and it's still mine and they have to give it back. This isn't rocket science. Duh. Okay, it's a very simple concept. It's mine. It means I get to decide what happens to it. I can throw it away. I can light it on fire. I can use it. I can give it to somebody else. I can trade, whatever. Duh. Sort of obvious. Why bother to bring that up? Because collectivists necessarily don't understand ownership, and a lot of what socialists and communists and collectivists in general babble on and on about is based on their own either misunderstanding about what ownership means or dishonesty about what it means. Now, there's two big things I'm gonna bash here. One is the notion of I'm against property. That property is oppressive and evil, capitalist, yada, yada, yada. Imagine no possessions. That's the first version of their fluffy-headed immoral bullshit, and I'll tell you why I call it that in a minute. The other version is everybody owns everything, which is the basis of communism. We all collectively own it. Okay, so I'm going to point out why both of those are dishonest bullshit. They're not even just irrational. They're all the way lying when they pretend either one of them. What would it mean to say that everybody owns this shoe? Now, communists try to pretend everybody collectively owns everything collectively. Let's start with a frickin' shoe. Everybody, we all own this communal shoe. What happens when two people want to use it? We'll include a whole pair of shoes to make it slightly less confusing. So two people at the same time want to use shoes. Now, if there's private property like they're my shoes, that is solved very easily, which is I get to decide all by myself. Nobody else gets to. I can say, okay, you can borrow my shoes for a while. You have to bring them back. Or I can say, no, I'm using them. You don't get them. That still resolves the dispute. And people who accept the concept of ownership and property say, okay, well, they're yours and I don't get to just steal them. Whatever, so that's solved. But if everybody owns them, what does it mean? Nothing. You can't have everybody having the exclusive right to decide what is done with something. It makes no sense. That's the opposite of what exclusive means. And the exclusive is essential to the concept of ownership. Because to say that I have the right to decide what's done with this, but so does everybody else, it means that nobody does. Because anytime there's a disagreement about what should be done with it, how do you resolve that? If two people have two different ideas, or 7 billion people have 7 billion different ideas of what to be done with it, who gets to decide? With collectivist bullshit, nobody does. And the two ways they frame it are nobody owns anything, we don't believe in private property, or everybody owns everything. And they mean the same thing, and both of them are meaningless drivel. They're both meaningless meaning. Because in both cases, it's saying nobody really has the right to decide what is done with that shoe. Now we can bicker and argue about who needs it most and who's entitled to it and who's oppressing me by holding on to the shoe and not giving it to me. It really is as I've said before, it really is the philosophy of cockroaches and sewer rats. If I want it, it's mine, and I should be able to take it. And this is why that's what you see in communism is people no longer focusing on producing anything, because if you produce something that doesn't give you any extra claim to it, doesn't make it yours under communism, because everything is everybody's. Your need supposedly does. The whole to each according to his need, from each according to his ability, disconnecting the two. So that it doesn't matter what you made, it's not yours if somebody needs it. So communism is a constant argument about who needs what. And that turns into a question of, well, who gets to decide who needs what? Well, we'll have a central committee that lays down the rules about deciding how blah, 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 and how things get distributed. if that central committee gets to decide who needs what and therefore who gets what, that central committee, by definition, owns everything. Because if theirs is the final say, if they're the final decider on who gets what, that's what it means to own something. They have the exclusive right to decide what is done with something. Which is why communism starts with this la-la land BS about everybody owns everything and ends up with, wow, now we have a centralized authoritarian ruling class that actually owns everything. Because it's the decider of what people need and blah, 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 blah. And the thing is, the notion of, because this came up in a argument I was having recently, the notion of collective ownership is already a mess, even if there's just two people. Let's say there's two people and they say, we went in, we chipped in money together and we bought that pair of shoes. And then one day, oh, that's excellent, I want to go climb a mountain, I need my sneakers, I need our sneakers for doing it. And the other one's, well, I was going to go like play football and I need sneakers. Obviously there's a conflict. And to say that two people own it is already a problem, because they can't each have the exclusive right to decide what's done with it. Like, well, I own 50% and you own 50%. Well, what does that mean? If I want them used for this on this day and you want them used for that on that day, they're not both going to happen. Well, we're each going to wear one shoe. They're not both going to happen. Who has the final say? And if it's 50-50, nobody does, and then it immediately turns into an unsolvable problem. Now, if people make an agreement and say, well, I'll let you use it and tomorrow I can't. Like, there's lots of ways that people can come to a consensus where they actually agree. But if they don't, if it comes down to, well, I want them for this and you want them for that, what does it mean that we both own them? It doesn't work. It doesn't logically work to say we both own it, because neither of us has an exclusive right to decide what's done with it. And on a larger scale, if you say, like, this is our collectively owned fifth wheel that I'm standing in. The community owns this. Let's say there's 100 people, and a few of them say, well, we want to live in it. And well, we want to drive it up into the mountains and live in it there. And if people have different ideas, and you say, well, it's communally owned, so the community owns this. The collective owns it, and we're going to vote or have a committee or however it's decided. It turns out that more people wanted it driven up into the mountains, and these few people are going to live in it. That means that absolutely everybody who didn't want that to happen, who voted against it and said, no, I totally oppose that, owned it. None. They didn't own it at all. If you're part of some collective, and the collective pretends to own something, and there's a vote, like that's how they decide what's done with it, and you lose the vote, it's exactly the same as you don't own a damn thing. Because to say, you're a part owner of this, but by the way, what you wanted to have happen to it didn't happen at all. 0% of what you wanted ended up happening because they had a vote. That means it's not yours. You ended up having no say in what happened to it. Well, I voted, so there was some chance that maybe I would have been in the majority. That doesn't matter. If you decided by vote, what that actually means is the majority who voted on it, they own it. The minority doesn't, because they didn't get what they wanted. They had no say in the matter, exactly the same as, well, some other person just wandering down the street says, hey, can I ask you to do something else with it? No, you lose. Okay, well, I didn't own it either. If your say counts for 0% of what actually happens with something, by definition, you don't own it. And in any collective and in any notion of communism, that is always the case for almost everything. Like if you, well, I want that particular sandwich to be my lunch. Okay, if it ends up not being your lunch, it means you didn't own it. If it ends up not being your decision, what happens to it, that by definition means you didn't own it. And if some committee or some vote or some ruling class or some government or anything else made the decision on behalf of the people, that's BS. That means they own everything. So the notion, the foundation of collectivism, communism, socialism, there's different ways to describe it and different ways to define it, but it's all based on inherently bogus notion of collective ownership of either a whole bunch of stuff or everything. Like, well, it's just collective ownership of the means of production. All right, the means of production. So we have this factory that we're going to steal in the name of the people, which immediately raises the question, wait, the people you stole it from don't have ownership of it anymore. So apparently they don't count as part of the collective that owns it. And then a bunch of people in the collective say, well, we wanted this. And a committee or a vote or something decides, here's what's going to be done with this factory and here's how it's going to be run. Meanwhile, a bunch of other people say, we don't want it run that way. We don't think that's fair. Those people, if they have no say in what ends up happening, doesn't matter how loudly they whined about it, if they had no say in what ends up happening, by definition, they didn't own it. So the idea of the collective owning the means of production or the collective owning anything is total bullshit. It's logically impossible. Because it's impossible for a whole bunch of people to each exclusively have the right to decide what's done with something. And you can even see that in the relatively free market of the US, even in like the best situation there should be is like a marriage. Two people who totally love each other jointly own this thing, and hopefully they can come to an agreement every time of what's done with that thing, whatever that thing is, a sink or a car or whatever the heck it is. But if they can't, then what? Like, is there a tiebreaker? Like, whoever wins, whoever has the final say in what is done with that thing, by definition is the owner. Now, the owner might share it a whole lot and let the other person do it. Like, a parent might say, well, we have this second car and our son or our daughter, we let them drive it around a whole bunch. But that's us letting them. If it's my decision at the end of the day, what happens with that car, it's mine. No matter how much somebody else is allowed to use it at my, choice, it's still mine. By definition, the person who has the final say. And if nobody has the final say, and this is the main problem with communism and why it ends with violence and stupidity and people being lazy and fighting about need, if nobody has the final say, of course it's going to descend into violence. Because if everybody thinks I need it and therefore I'm entitled to it, and the guy next to him thinks the same thing about himself, and everybody thinks I need it, therefore I'm entitled to it, then of course there's going to be a conflict, because every one of those people thinks they have the final say of what happens to it, and anybody else trying to use it, that counts as violence, and you're oppressing me and robbing me and blah, 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 blah. This is why communism, even in like communes, so often leads to unfairness and power struggles and violence and people freaking out and running away and people stealing and stuff. Because if you don't understand that that thing belongs to that person and I need his consent to use it or to have it, or I can trade with him, and if he consents to an exchange, then it can become mine. That is it's not, people talk about capitalism as if it's some complex theory of economic. It's not being an idiot. It's literally not being an idiot and figuring out if somebody makes something, it's his. If somebody builds a hut, I don't get to just go, well, I need a hut, get out. It's mine now. That's the stupid animal way. The rational human being way is, well, I didn't make that thing. It's his. I might ask if I can use it. I might make a trade. I might build a boat and trade it for his thing if he consents to that. But the concept of ownership is essential to being rational and moral. You cannot be a moral human being and not believe in ownership and property. It's impossible. Because if you don't believe in ownership and property, it means anybody has the right to take anything from anybody else at any time. Because that's the alternative to that thing belongs to that person and it's his choice what to do with it. That's property. So people say, I don't believe in property and ownership and possessions, then you don't believe in being moral. You believe in being a stupid, violent animal who just steals whatever they want, because there isn't another way to resolve it anytime there is a conflict of what people want done with a certain thing. And the fact that, communists can't even figure out how to resolve that with one thing, but they're pretending that their crappy philosophy will work perfectly fine to divide up or decide how everything on the planet is used by billions and billions of people. Yeah, that'll work marvelously when you can't even figure out how it would apply to a toothbrush. But it really is that simple. And the notion, it's not, when people look at it as if there's capitalism and communism as these like complex economic theories, it's not complex at all. It's just, are you an immoral idiot who thinks that at any given time, everyone has the same claim to everything as everybody else, and therefore there is no way to decide who has the moral right to use anything. It's just grab it and steal and use it. Or do you accept that, hey, everybody owns themselves and owns the fruits of their own labor, and therefore what somebody acquired by voluntary means is theirs, and I have zero right to use it or take it without their consent and without their agreement. And if, there's lots of ways to voluntarily interact, but those are the two options, and they're not like complex economic theories at all. It's just, are you a stupid, immoral animal? Or are you rational and moral and you understand I shouldn't steal what somebody else produced? Communists don't understand that you shouldn't steal what somebody else produced. And they make up these long-winded bullshit rationalizations. Well, the means of production should be collectively owned so that the blah, 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 blah. And the entire purpose of all of that bullshit is to create a justification where they get to steal shit from other people to fulfill their supposed needs. It's a lazy thief mentality, and that's all it freaking is. And the ones who pretend it's about sharing and blah, 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 no, it freaking isn't. If you don't have an exclusive right to decide what's done with something, you can't share it with somebody else. It's not freaking yours. I can share what's mine. That depends upon the concept of ownership and property. If it's my choice to give something to somebody else, that's actual charity. That's actual compassion. And it completely depends upon the existence of property ownership to begin with, because I can't give what isn't mine. So when they pretend it's about compassion and sharing, that's utter BS. It's just about entitlement mentality, BS, and wanting permission to steal shit from people who have more than them. And it's funny how often communists always want to focus on the relationship between them and people with more than them, and don't really want to focus on the relationship between them and the billions of people who have less than them. So they're always like, we have to tax the American rich because we should have free housing and free food and free this. How about you shut your yapping pie hole and give that computer in front of you to one of the several billion people in the world who are way less rich than you are, you hypocritical bastard. But they don't. They sit around bitching about it because they don't believe in it as a principle, because it doesn't make sense as a principle. It's just an excuse for envy and hopefully using the collective or the committee or the government to steal other people's shit. That's why there are communists and socialists, and the whole claim of it being compassionate and loving is BS. If they actually believe that need determines who gets to have what and who gets to use what, they would immediately give everything they have to somebody in India or China, India or Africa, or, one of the places where several billion people are way more impoverished than anybody in the U.S., but they don't. Because it's not rational, and it's not moral, and it's not even a philosophy. It's just, I want free stuff, I feel entitled, I'm going to make up this thing and pretend it's a philosophy to have an excuse to steal what other people have produced. That's all it is. And if you even just understand what ownership means and walk through the very basic logic, you realize communism, the notion of everybody owns everything or nobody owns everything, either way, they amount to the same meaningless crap. Either way, that really is an insane and evil way to view the world, because what it means is anybody can take anything from anybody else, and it's never bad because that anybody else didn't actually have a rightful claim to it, didn't actually have an exclusive right to decide what's done with it. And a grand total of 0 communists ever live their own life by that policy and by that idea. Because if you walk up to them and grab whatever they're holding and walk away, or swipe their shoes and walk away, they're going to go, hey, because they know damn well that's not how moral people behave when they're on the receiving end. They just want to be on the end that benefits from the stealing and the envy and the extortion. But it's a completely dishonest bullshit way to view things. And if you just understand what ownership means, you can't be a communist, because it doesn't make any sense.